Imagine being trapped behind enemy lines, a prisoner of war for 16 brutal months, watching your hope drain away one failed escape at a time. Now imagine stealing a German fighter plane, flying it across hostile territory where your own allies might shoot you down, gambling everything on a single desperate flight to freedom. This is not fiction. This is not Hollywood exaggeration. This is the true story of Robert A. Hoover, an American fighter pilot who did the impossible. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories of courage that defy belief, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and after you hear what this man survived, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and what you would have done in his place. Stay until the end, because what you are about to hear is one of the most extraordinary escapes in the history of aviation warfare. This is a story that demands to be told. The morning of February 9, 1944, broke cold and clear over the Mediterranean Sea. Second Lieutenant Robert A. Hoover sat strapped into the cramped cockpit of his Supermarine Spitfire Mark V, feeling the familiar vibration of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine through the control stick. At 22 years old, he was already a veteran, already hardened by combat in ways that would have broken other men. This was his 59th mission. 59 times he had climbed into the sky to hunt and be hunted. 59 times he had returned. Today would be different. The mission briefing had been routine. Escort bombers, protect the formation, engage enemy fighters only if necessary. Standard procedures that masked the reality of modern aerial warfare, which was anything but standard. It was a chess game played at 300 miles per hour, where a single mistake meant death, and where luck mattered as much as skill. Hoover checked his instruments with practiced efficiency. Fuel gauge, oil pressure, oxygen flow, everything had to be perfect because nothing ever stayed perfect for long. The Spitfire was a beautiful machine, elegant and deadly, but it was also temperamental. It demanded respect. It demanded constant attention, and on long missions over water, it demanded prayers. The formation climbed through scattered clouds, the bombers heavy and slow, the fighters darting around them like protective wolves. Hoover scanned the sky continuously, his eyes never resting, searching for the telltale glint of sunlight on metal that would betray an enemy aircraft. German fighters were out there. They were always out there. And they were good, very good. The first indication of trouble came not from enemy action but from his own instruments. The fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that a pilot with 58 missions behind him would notice. Enough to plant a seed of worry that began to grow with every passing minute. He did the mental arithmetic: distance covered, distance remaining, fuel consumption rate. The numbers did not add up the way they should. Somewhere in the system, fuel was being lost. A leak, a crack, a faulty seal. It did not matter what caused it. What mattered was that his safety margin was evaporating. Then the radio crackled with urgent voices. Bandits, 9 o'clock high. Hoover's head snapped left and up. There. 6,000 feet above and closing fast. German fighters Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving out of the sun with tactical precision. The formation scattered as training took over. Throttle forward, stick back, climb to meet the threat. The Spitfire responded instantly, the Merlin engine howling as it clawed for altitude. What followed was chaos measured in seconds. Aircraft screaming past each other at combined speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Tracer rounds arcing through the sky like deadly fireworks. The stomach-lurching sensation of high-G turns that pushed blood away from the brain and turned vision gray at the edges. Hoover locked onto a Messerschmitt, led it perfectly, pressed the firing button. His cannons hammered. Pieces flew off the German fighter. Smoke, but no kill. The enemy pilot was skilled. braking hard left and diving away before Hoover could finish him. And then fire. Not in the enemy aircraft, in his own. The explosion came from somewhere behind the cockpit, a metallic bang followed immediately by the acrid smell of burning aviation fuel. Hoover's instruments went berserk, engine temperature spiking, oil pressure plummeting. A German fighter had gotten behind him, and he had been too focused on his own target to notice until rounds tore through his fuselage. The Spitfire shuddered. Black smoke began pouring from the engine cowling. Fire was the nightmare every pilot feared most, not the clean death of a catastrophic explosion, but the horror of being burned alive while trapped in a metal coffin at 15,000 feet. Hoover made the decision in less than a heartbeat. He could not save the aircraft. He could only save himself. His hand moved to the canopy release. The transparent dome slid back, and instantly the cockpit filled with freezing wind and thicker smoke. He disconnected his oxygen mask, unbuckled his harness, and with strength born of pure survival instinct, hauled himself up and out of the dying fighter. The slipstream hit him like a physical blow, tearing him away from the Spitfire and sending him tumbling through space. Sky, sea, sky, sea. The world spun in a nauseating blur. He pulled the ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that felt like it might dislocate both shoulders. Then suddenly there was silence. Not true silence. The wind still rushed past. Distant engine sounds still echoed across the sky. But after the screaming chaos of combat, it felt like silence. Hoover looked down. The Mediterranean stretched out below him, a vast expanse of dark blue water that looked deceptively calm from altitude, deceptively peaceful. He knew better. That water was February cold. Survival time measured in hours at best. More likely minutes. He watched his Spitfire spiral down, trailing flame and smoke until it hit the water and disappeared. Somewhere above, the dogfight continued without him. He was alone now. Alone with gravity and the approaching sea and the certain knowledge that he was in serious trouble. The water rushed up faster than seemed possible. He had time to take one deep breath to brace himself and then impact. The shock of the cold drove that breath out in an explosive gasp. The parachute dragged him under. He fought his way out of the harness, fingers already going numb, kicked toward what he hoped was the surface, broke through gasping. The cold was unimaginable. It was not just uncomfortable. It was actively lethal, a physical force that seemed to reach inside his body and squeeze his organs. His flight suit offered minimal protection. He inflated his life vest, but that only kept him afloat. It did nothing against the cold. Hoover forced himself to think. Panic would kill him faster than hypothermia. He needed to conserve energy. He needed to stay conscious. He needed to believe that rescue would come, even though he knew the odds. The Mediterranean was enormous. He was one man in all that water. The chances of anyone finding him were microscopically small. Hours passed, or perhaps it was minutes that felt like hours. Time became elastic, unreliable. The cold seeped deeper. His limbs grew heavy. Shivering, which had been violent at first, began to fade. That was a bad sign. He knew that was a bad sign. When the body stopped shivering, it meant the core temperature was dropping to critical levels. It meant the end was near. He thought about home, about Tennessee, about his family, about all the things he had wanted to do and might never do now. He thought about the supreme irony of surviving 59 combat missions only to die alone in the ocean. Then through the fog of encroaching hypothermia, he heard an engine, not an aircraft engine, a ship. Hoover tried to shout, but his voice came out as a weak croak. He tried to wave, but his arms barely moved. He watched, helpless, as a vessel approached. As it grew closer, he could make out details. The gray paint, the angular lines, the flag. a German naval patrol boat. The irony was so profound it was almost funny. Shot down by Germans, saved by Germans from one kind of captivity into another, but at least he would be warm, at least he would live, for now. Hands reached down and pulled him from the water. German sailors, young men who might have been his friends in another life, wrapped him in blankets and carried him below deck. They gave him hot liquid that burned going down but spread warmth through his core. They spoke to him in German, which he did not understand, but their intent was clear. They had saved his life. Now he was their prisoner. The journey to shore passed in a blur, then transportation inland, then processing, then finally Stalag Luft 1, a prisoner of war camp on the Baltic coast, specifically designed to hold captured Allied airmen. The camp was a study in systematic dehumanization. Rows of identical wooden barracks surrounded by double fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers at regular intervals, each manned by soldiers with machine guns and searchlights. A warning wire running parallel to the fence, beyond which prisoners would be shot without hesitation. The message was clear. This place was designed not just to contain bodies but to break spirits. Hoover was processed with mechanical efficiency. His personal effects were catalogued and confiscated. He was given a prisoner number. He was photographed. He was assigned to a barracks, and then he was left to adapt to his new reality. That reality was grim. The food was barely sufficient to sustain life. Thin soup, black bread that was more sawdust than grain, occasional scraps of meat that were better not examined too closely. Men lost weight rapidly, their bodies consuming themselves to stay alive. Disease was rampant: dysentery, tuberculosis, pneumonia. The camp hospital was less a place of healing than a waiting room for death. But the physical hardships were nothing compared to the psychological warfare. The boredom, the hopelessness, the slow erosion of identity that came from being reduced to a number in a cage. Some men retreated into themselves and never came back. Others went quietly mad. The strong ones found ways to resist, small acts of defiance that reminded them they were still human, still soldiers, still fighting even without weapons. Hoover chose resistance. His first escape attempt came within 2 weeks of arrival. It was crude, desperate, doomed from the start. He tried to slip out during a work detail, simply walking away when he thought the guards were not watching closely. He made it perhaps 200 yards before dogs found him. The punishment was 10 days in solitary confinement, a concrete cell barely large enough to lie down in. No light, no human contact except when guards shoved food through a slot in the door. No sound except his own breathing and the slow drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Those 10 days should have broken him, should have taught him that resistance was futile. Instead, they taught him patience. They taught him that he could endure, and they taught him that he needed to be smarter. His second attempt was more sophisticated. He joined a tunneling operation, one of several being dug simultaneously by different groups of prisoners. For weeks, men took turns scraping away dirt with improvised tools, hiding the excavated soil in their clothing and scattering it during exercise periods. The tunnel grew slowly, painfully slowly, worming its way under the fence toward the tree line beyond. They were perhaps 30 feet from freedom when the guards discovered it. Someone had talked, or someone had been careless, or the Germans had simply gotten lucky. The tunnel was collapsed. The conspirators were rounded up. Hoover earned another stint in solitary, this time 2 weeks. He tried again, and again, and again, each attempt different, each attempt a little smarter, hiding in supply trucks, forging documents, disguising himself as a guard, cutting wire, climbing fences. Every method he could conceive he tried, and every time he failed. By the time 20 attempts had ended in failure and solitary confinement, other prisoners thought he was crazy. They told him to stop, to accept captivity, to wait for the war to end. But Hoover could not accept. Acceptance meant surrender, and surrender meant letting the Germans win not just the battle but the war for his soul. The months in solitary confinement, accumulating like scar tissue, did something unexpected. They gave him time to think, time to plan, time to realize that if he was ever going to escape successfully, it would not be by running through the forest or hiding in a truck. It would be by doing something so audacious, so unexpected, that the Germans would not see it coming until it was too late. He would steal an airplane. The idea was insane. Hoover knew it was insane. But sanity had not served him well in this place, so he began to prepare for madness. Stalag Luft 1 held thousands of Allied airmen, pilots and navigators and bombardiers and gunners, men who had flown every type of aircraft in the Allied inventory. More importantly, some of them had flown against German aircraft. Some of them had studied German aircraft. Some of them had examined captured German aircraft and memorized every detail. Hoover sought these men out. In whispered conversations during exercise periods, in coded messages passed during meal times, in the long empty hours of confinement, he learned. He learned the cockpit layout of the Messerschmitt Bf 109. He learned the starting procedure for the Focke-Wulf Fw 190. He learned the control surfaces, the throttle settings, the peculiarities and quirks of aircraft he had only ever seen through a gun sight. The other prisoners thought it was theoretical, a way to pass the time, a mental exercise to stave off boredom. They did not realize he was serious. They did not realize he was building a database of knowledge that he intended to use. Months became a year. A year became 16 months. The winter of 1944 gave way to the spring of 1945, and the war entered its final phase. Even in the isolated bubble of the camp, prisoners could sense the change. The guards were more nervous. Supplies came less regularly. Discipline, which had always been harsh but consistent, began to crack. In April, rumors began to circulate. The Soviets were coming. The Red Army was advancing from the east, crushing everything in its path. The Germans were in full retreat. The war was ending, and everyone in the camp knew it. The only question was what would happen to the prisoners when Soviet forces arrived. Some guards began to desert, slipping away in the night. Others became more vicious, as if trying to prove their loyalty to a regime that was already collapsing. The camp descended into chaos. Fights broke out. Prisoners who had endured years of captivity with stoic discipline suddenly could not contain their anger and fear and desperate hope. On April 20th, 1945, the chaos reached its peak. A riot erupted in the main yard. Prisoners demanding better food, demanding information, demanding to be told what was going to happen to them. The guards responded with gunfire, not aimed to kill, but to intimidate, warning shots that ricocheted off buildings and sent men diving for cover. In the confusion, in the screaming chaos of 15,000 prisoners and overwhelmed guards, Hoover saw his chance. He found 2 other prisoners, men he had come to trust during the long months of confinement. He did not tell them his full plan. He simply said they were leaving, now, tonight, and he moved before they could question him. The fence was still electrified, but the power had been intermittent for days. Hoover gambled that in the chaos, no one would notice 3 men testing a section of wire. He used a wooden board to press against it. No shock, no spark. He pulled. The wire gave way, cut through with wire cutters someone had fashioned weeks ago from scavenged metal. They crawled through, then they ran. Behind them, the camp continued to burn and riot and tear itself apart. Ahead was darkness and the vast unknown of a country in collapse. Germany in April of 1945 was a landscape of defeat. Cities reduced to rubble, refugees clogging every road, military units retreating in disorder or surrendering wholesale. It was the end of the world, and Hoover was trying to navigate through the apocalypse. They moved west, always west, toward Allied lines, guided by the stars and by instinct and by the simple logic that west meant away from the Soviets and toward the Americans and British. They traveled at night, hid during the day, ate whatever they could find or steal. On the second night, exhausted and starving, they knocked on the door of a farmhouse on the outskirts of a small village. An elderly woman answered, her face lined with the deep wrinkles of age and hardship. She should have turned them in. She should have called the authorities. Instead, she looked at these three scarecrow-thin men in filthy prisoner clothing, and something in her expression softened. She fed them, real food, bread and cheese and vegetables from her garden. It was the first proper meal Hoover had eaten in 16 months. He wanted to cry from the simple goodness of it. When they prepared to leave, she stopped them. She disappeared into a back room and returned with something wrapped in cloth. A pistol, old but functional. She pressed it into Hoover's hands and spoke in German he did not understand. But her meaning was clear. Take this. Protect yourselves. Survive. Hoover never learned her name, never learned what happened to her when the war ended, but he carried the memory of her kindness like a talisman. They continued west, moving through a country that was tearing itself apart. They passed columns of German soldiers retreating in defeat. They hid from patrols. They navigated around bombed-out towns where the dead still lay in the streets. And on the third day, they came to an airfield. It was small, probably a forward operating base for fighters. It had been heavily damaged, cratered by bombing and strafed by Allied aircraft. Wrecked planes littered the edges of the field, their twisted metal carcasses serving as monuments to Germany's collapsing air force. But not everything was destroyed. In a damaged hangar, partially concealed by debris, sat a Focke-Wulf Fw 190. The aircraft looked intact, battle-worn but intact. It wore the gray-green camouflage and black crosses of the Luftwaffe. To Allied pilots, it was one of the most dangerous fighters in the sky, fast and heavily armed. To Hoover, staring at it in the dim light of dawn, it was salvation. His companions thought he was joking when he said he was going to fly it. Then they realized he was serious, and they thought he was insane. He had never flown a German aircraft. He had never even sat in one. All he had was second-hand knowledge whispered to him by other prisoners, mental diagrams built from descriptions and guesswork. The odds of successfully starting it, much less flying it, much less landing it alive, were astronomically small. Hoover did not care about the odds. He had not cared about the odds for 16 months. The problem was the starter. German fighters used an inertia starter system, a flywheel that had to be wound up manually before it could turn over the engine. It required strength and mechanical knowledge that Hoover did not have. But he did not need to have it. He just needed to find someone who did. In a small building near the hangar, they found a German mechanic, middle-aged, gray-haired, wearing a grease-stained uniform. He looked up as the three escaped prisoners entered, and his expression went through a rapid evolution. Surprise, fear, resignation. Hoover showed him the pistol the old woman had given him. He did not speak German, but he did not need to. The message was universal. Start the aircraft. Do it now. Do not try anything stupid. The mechanic was terrified, but he was also a professional. He moved to the Focke-Wulf and began the starting procedure with shaking hands. He inserted the hand crank into the inertia starter and began to wind. It took time, physical effort, the flywheel gradually building momentum. When it reached the right speed, he engaged it. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. The sound was enormous in the confined space. The BMW radial engine hammered out over 1,500 horsepower, the propeller becoming a blur. Hoover had to shout to be heard over the noise. He told his companions to run, to head west on foot, to get to Allied lines however they could. This aircraft only had one seat. He could not take them with him. They argued. He ignored them. He climbed into the cockpit, settling into a seat designed for a German pilot, surrounded by instruments labeled in German, by controls that were similar to American aircraft but not identical. The mechanic stood below, probably wondering if he should try to stop this madman. Hoover pointed the pistol at him again and gestured for him to move back. Then he was alone. Alone in a German fighter on a German airfield in the middle of Germany. He had no radio, no maps, no parachute, no idea if he even remembered the control layout correctly. What he had was desperation and courage and a fundamental unwillingness to die in captivity. He released the brakes. The Focke-Wulf lurched forward. He tested the rudder pedals, the stick getting a feel for the aircraft's response. It was heavier than a Spitfire, more stable, less nimble. The visibility from the cockpit was different. Everything was different. But the basics of flight were universal. Throttle for speed, stick for attitude, rudder for direction. The runway was cratered but not impassable. Hoover taxied to the least damaged section, turned into the wind and pushed the throttle forward. The engine's roar intensified. The aircraft accelerated. Too fast. The takeoff roll seemed impossibly short. He pulled back on the stick perhaps too early, and the Focke-Wulf staggered into the air, hanging on the edge of a stall before gaining speed and climbing. He was flying. He was actually flying a German fighter. The moment of elation lasted perhaps 3 seconds before reality reasserted itself. He was flying a German fighter over Germany. Every Allied pilot in the sky was trained to shoot German fighters on sight. Every anti-aircraft battery would target him. His own side would try to kill him, and they would be right to try. He was flying an enemy aircraft with enemy markings, and there was no way to signal his true identity. He turned west, navigating by the sun and by terrain features he hoped he recognized from briefings and from maps he had studied years ago. Rivers, roads, the distinctive patterns of bombed cities. He flew low, hoping to avoid attention, but not so low that he could not maneuver if attacked. The fuel gauge showed less than half full. That was a problem. He did not know the Focke-Wulf's fuel consumption rate. He did not know its maximum range. He did not know how far he could fly before the engine died, and he became a passenger in an unpowered glider looking for a place to crash. Minutes stretched into an hour. The landscape below changed gradually. Less destruction, fewer obvious military targets. He must be getting close to the front lines, that fluid boundary between German and Allied control. Close to salvation, close to being shot down by his own people. Then the engine began to run rough. The steady roar became an uneven cough. The fuel gauge was reading near empty. Hoover's hands tightened on the controls. He had perhaps minutes left, maybe less. Below, the landscape had changed again. Flat agricultural land, fields, small farms. It looked like the Netherlands, liberated by Allied forces in recent months, if he could just get a little farther, if the engine would just hold together a little longer. It did not. With a final cough and a shudder, the BMW radial engine died. The propeller windmilled uselessly. Suddenly, the cockpit was eerily quiet except for the whistle of wind over the airframe. Hoover became a glider pilot. He scanned the ground, looking for any flat space long enough to land on. There, A field recently plowed, maybe 500 meters long, it would have to do. He set up his approach, managing his airspeed carefully. Too fast and he would overshoot. Too slow and he would stall and crash. The ground rushed up. He flared at what he hoped was the right moment, felt the wheels touch, and then the Focke-Wulf was plowing through soft earth, decelerating rapidly, bouncing and shaking. Metal screamed. Something broke. But the aircraft slowed, and finally stopped. Hoover sat in the cockpit for a long moment, unable to quite believe he was still alive. Then he popped the canopy, unbuckled his harness, and climbed out onto the wing. He was immediately surrounded by Dutch civilians who had seen the aircraft come down. They were shouting in Dutch, angry, hostile. They saw the German markings. They saw a pilot in tattered clothing climbing out of a Luftwaffe fighter. They assumed he was the enemy. Hoover raised his hands and shouted the only thing that mattered. "I am American, American." He repeated it over and over, his voice hoarse with desperation. "I am American." The crowd hesitated. One man, older, stepped forward and spoke in broken English. "You are American." Yes, I escaped from a prison camp. I stole this aircraft. I am Second Lieutenant Robert Hoover, United States Army Air Forces." The mood shifted. Confusion replaced anger. Someone ran for the British forces stationed nearby. Within an hour, British soldiers arrived in trucks. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, clearly unsure what to make of a man in prison camp rags standing next to a German fighter claiming to be an American pilot. Hoover told his story. They did not believe him at first. It was too fantastic, too impossible. But he knew details only an American pilot would know. He knew squadron designations. He knew bases. He knew the names of commanders. Slowly, their skepticism faded. They took him to headquarters for debriefing. Officers questioned him for hours, verifying his identity, extracting every detail of his escape. They could barely believe what he had done. Stealing an enemy aircraft and flying it to freedom was the stuff of adventure novels, not real life. But it had happened. The Focke-Wulf sat in a Dutch field as proof. Robert Hoover, prisoner of war, had done the impossible. The war ended less than 3 weeks later on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The nightmare was over. Hoover was repatriated, sent home to the United States, reunited with his family. He had survived. But survival was not the end of his story. It was only the beginning. The man who had endured 16 months as a prisoner, who had stolen a German fighter and flown it to freedom, returned to a country at peace and did not know how to stop flying. He became a test pilot, one of the greatest in aviation history. He flew experimental aircraft that killed other pilots. He pushed machines to their limits and beyond. He survived crashes that should have been fatal. And he became famous as an airshow pilot, performing aerobatic demonstrations that left audiences speechless. For more than 50 years, Bob Hoover thrilled millions with his flying skills, performing maneuvers that seemed to defy physics. He poured iced tea while flying upside down to demonstrate his smoothness on the controls. He flew airshow routines with both engines shut off, pure glider demonstrations of precision and timing. He became a legend, not just for what he had survived, but for what he had become. He died on October 25, 2016, at the age of 94. By then, he had logged more than 50,000 hours of flight time in nearly every aircraft imaginable. But of all the flights he ever made, none was more important than the one on that desperate day in April of 1945, when a desperate man stole an enemy fighter and flew it toward hope. Bob Hoover's escape was not just a story of survival. It was a story of refusing to surrender. It was a story of using knowledge as a weapon. It was a story of courage that went beyond the ordinary definition of the word, because courage is not the absence of fear. It is taking action despite fear. It is climbing into an aircraft you have never flown in enemy territory with no training and no backup plan because the alternative is to remain a prisoner. His legacy endures in the pilots who still tell his story with awe, in the aviation museums that display his achievements, in everyone who hears what he did and realizes that the impossible is sometimes just the untried. If you found this story as incredible as we did, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of extraordinary courage and impossible survival. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Bob Hoover's place. Would you have kept trying to escape after 20 failures? Would you have climbed into that German fighter knowing you might be shot down by your own side? And most importantly, tell us where you are watching from. What city? What state? What country? Because stories like this connect us across all boundaries. Bob Hoover proved that the human spirit cannot be caged. That determination can overcome impossible odds. That sometimes, when everything is on the line, the only choice is to fly toward freedom and trust that courage will carry you home.